Despite the state diving into the red after it spent federal COVID subsidies, high-profile figures in the California reparations movement haven't slackened in their push for the scheme since, of course, I reported on it back in December. In fact, one so-called reparations pusher says that the current proposal of $223,000 handed to each of the government's chosen recipients isn't enough. And it turns out that the head of the reparations task force has implied that she agrees. Hi everyone, I'm Gardner Goldsmith for MRC-TV, and here's the story. Scott Whitlock reports for Fox News that Reverend Tony Pierce, head of the Black Wall Street Project, made something of a spectacle of himself Friday in San Diego, becoming agitated, slightly nonsensical, and loud as his time at the microphone expired.
200,000 is not enough.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And it might not have been his encounter with the time constraints that prompted Reverend Pierce to lose any connection with reality. And just before that bit of bluster, he actually advocated for the so-called reparations money storm to be so expensive that it shower cash on non-residents.
There should be no resident requirements for California. We have to encourage our people to come back to California. What better way to encourage our people to come back to California if we have no requirements?
Which seems to be only fitting for a proposal that literally would see the state take from people who haven't harmed anybody, thus making them victims, and give it to people who have no specific claims of harm against them. As I noted in December, California came into the United States as a non-slave state, which might be one of the reasons that this task force is claiming its reparations push is for descendants of slaves. Again, California wasn't a slave state. And because of what they amorphously claim are decades of discrimination and gaps in housing policies, theoretically ascribed to racism. By the way, the task force doesn't distinguish between government and private housing so-called policies. And they go back looking at these things for 100 years. But as I also noted, that person-on-person injury thing, well, that's supposed to be handled through a common law tort system where people can actually claim damages have been done to them by real people. And, quote, beyond the fact that none of these potential recipients of reparations was injured and therefore cannot be made whole through these fictitiously termed reparations, there is the fact that even if one were to believe that the descendants of slaves deserve to have the state make slaves out of people today, such that these new slaves, the taxpayers, will hand over big sums of cash for things they never did, the history of slavery is such that virtually every individual in any race can claim that at one time or another, his or her ancestors were enslaved or preyed upon. Where does this original sin for slavery concept end? I also offered keen observations from Dr. Thomas Sowell, who noted, quote, blacks were not enslaved because they were black, but because they were available. Slavery has existed in the world for thousands of years. Whites enslaved other whites in Europe for centuries before the first black was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Asians enslaved Europeans. Asians enslaved other Asians. Africans enslaved other Africans. And indeed, even today in North Africa, blacks continue to enslave blacks. Even the likely etymology of the term slave broadens one's perspective on how widespread and ancient the terrible crime of slavery has been. As Atlas of Enslavement notes, quote, a large number of Slavs are said to have been captured in battles with armies from the Eastern Roman Empire and taken away as slaves. From the 9th century on, the name of the people and the legal status became mixed. The name of the Slavs may have been given to slaves as a result of the long-distance slave trade. According to this theory, this trade increased significantly in the early Middle Ages when large numbers of Slavs were on the market. In fact, as Paul Farrell reports for the Daily Mail, Reverend Pierce has been advocating since at least December for the proposed recipients of this government-extracted graft to receive more, which is stunning coming from a Christian perspective. In addition to being the so-called Black Wall Street CEO, Pierce is supposedly a man of the cloth, a reverend, yet he appears to think that it's not only morally acceptable for the state to steal billions from people who never did anything wrong. He seems to think it's morally imperative for the state to hand that out to people who never were wronged by said taxpayers, and he seems to believe that it is morally acceptable for the proposed recipients to then accept this ill-gotten cash. Yet his audacity actually was trumped early on in the life of this celebrated task force in California. Leslie Eastman reported January 8th for legal insurrection. Reparations Task Force Chair Camilla Moore said economists on the panel estimated that Black Californians descended from slaves were somehow owed $1 million each in reparations. Is this lower $223,000 per person idea somehow the task force's bargain? It sounds more like mafia dons cutting deals for the victims who live in their turf than anything else. But I think if we look at this, there are three major lessons that come out that are even deeper than everything we've mentioned so far. First, if these so-called reparations are supposedly for real person-on-person criminality, not the amorphous term discrimination, well, those people have not been identified, and most of them long ago passed away. Second, if these are reparations for state activity, again, most of the victims are long gone. And calculating how their progeny might or might not have been harmed or helped by the state action is nearly impossible. And that brings us to the third lesson, which I think is more fundamental. If the culprit supposedly is the California government going back a century, then that means those who did not want to pay for the government to engage in its activity, those who didn't vote for one or another or all of the politicians who took office to promote those policies, and who didn't want to pay for the policies to be enforced by tax-funded police and judges and all of them, those people can't be implicated. They were slaves to the state itself. Of course, most of those multitudes also cannot be identified. As it is today, government has been always what 19th century French economist Frédéric Bastiat said it is. That great fiction through which everyone endeavors to live at the expense of everyone else. Thanks for watching, everybody. Please join us on Rumble where they don't censor us. Please visit MRCTV.org. That's MRCTV.org. The MRCTV channel on Rumble is hopping. The MRCTV channel on YouTube is hopping as well, where sometimes they censor us. And it's always happening at MRCTV.org. You can also find us on Facebook and on Twitter, on TikTok and Instagram. And if you want to find me on Gab, I'm at Gardner Goldsmith. And on Twitter, I'm at Gard Goldsmith. Thanks so much, compadres. For MRC TV, I'm Gardner Goldsmith.